On the morning of October 7, 1959, Dr. Hajime Hosokawa brought the results of his experiment to the management of the Chisso Corporation's chemical plant in Minamata, Japan. He reported what had happened to cat number 400, fed wastewater drawn directly from the acetaldehyde production line. The cat had developed convulsions, lost coordination, and collapsed through the same neurological deterioration that had been appearing in residents around the bay for the last 3 years. Dr. Hosokawa had exposed what Chisso had suspected all along. Management told him to stop the experiments and say nothing. He complied. Japan in the 1950s was living through what economists would later call a post-war economic miracle. A nation that was industrially destroyed a decade earlier was rebuilding at a pace that surprised the world. Chisso Corporation's chemical plant in Minamata was a celebrated player in the recovery, a facility that employed approximately a fifth of the city's working population. Chisso had filled the municipal treasury by producing the industrial chemicals that fed the wider manufacturing surge. Chisso Corporation had operated in Minamata since 1908. The city sits at the head of a small bay on the western coast of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island, a bay roughly 4 kilometers long, partially enclosed, with limited tidal exchange. From 1932 onward, the plant produced acetaldehyde, a chemical intermediate used in manufacturing plastics, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural chemicals, using mercury sulfate as a catalyst. The intended industrial reaction recovers the mercury and cycles it back into the process. In reality, side reactions converted a portion of the mercury into methylmercury compounds, which exited the plant in the wastewater. The plant discharged the wastewater through an effluent channel into Hyakin Harbor, a small inlet at the bay's head, from which contamination spread into the bay and then into the broader Yatsushiro Sea beyond. For the people living along that bay, none of this was visible. The fish and water looked the same as they always had. However, mercury was accumulating in the sediment, working its way up through the food chain with each passing year. By approximately 1952, there were the first signs that something was off in the bay. Fishermen began noticing the local cats convulsing, losing coordination, and walking in circles. The symptoms were distinct enough that local people named it the dancing cat disease. By the late 1950s, there were almost no cats left in the fishing communities around the bay. Crows and seabirds that were once numerous had disappeared from the shoreline, and dead fish floated near the harbor mouth. The fishermen made the reasonable observation that whatever was killing the wildlife was likely coming from the Chisso factory. In April 1956, a 5-year-old girl was brought to the local hospital with severe neurological symptoms. She was convulsing and could barely walk or speak. Her 2-year-old sister was admitted days later. Hosokawa reported the cases to the Minamata Public Health Office on May 1, 1956. That date became the official discovery of Minamata disease. Kumamoto University dispatched a research team, and by November of that year, they had identified heavy metal poisoning from consumed fish and shellfish as the probable cause. By 1957, researchers at the university were proposing methylmercury specifically as the responsible compound. A British neurologist who visited Japan in 1959 confirmed the organic mercury hypothesis independently. The science among researchers who had examined the patients and the bay was not seriously contested. What was contested was who would be required to act on it. The Japanese government classified Minamata disease in 1957 as a food poisoning of unknown cause. This framing was not neutral. Keeping the investigation inside the food safety system rather than the industrial pollution system meant the party most logically responsible for the discharge faced reduced regulatory scrutiny. Chisso used the resulting ambiguity aggressively, funding competing research that proposed manganese, thallium, and explosive residue as alternative causes, and maintaining that causation was scientifically unproven through the end of the decade. What Chisso did not say publicly was that it was running its own internal investigation at the same time. Dr. Hosokawa had begun the cat experiments in July 1958, authorized by Chisso management. The company, aware that external researchers were converging on the methylmercury hypothesis, wanted its own internal result before anyone outside reached the same conclusion. The protocol was direct. Feed the cats wastewater from various points in the production process and observe the results. Cat 400 received processed water from the acetaldehyde production step, the specific step using mercury sulfate as the catalyst, drawn from the production stream rather than a downstream effluent mixing point. It developed Minamata disease symptoms and died. Hosokawa's results were clear. The company's own production chemistry was the source. He brought the results to management on October 7, 1959. They ordered him to stop the experiments and forbade him from disclosing the findings to government officials, external researchers, or anyone else investigating the matter. With Cat 400 buried, Chisso moved to contain the situation publicly. In December 1959, the company installed what it called the Cyclator, a wastewater treatment system publicly announced as resolving the contamination problem. Independent researchers who later examined its operation found it did not remove methylmercury from the effluent. The announcement itself was the point. On December 30th, 3 weeks after the Cyclator was unveiled, Chisso offered sympathy payments to victim families. The contracts were not settlements. They were structured around a clause stating that recipients agreed to make no further claims against Chisso, even if a casual relationship between their disease and the factory was subsequently established. The clause explicitly anticipated future proof of causation and attempted to extinguish that liability in advance. Payments ranged from roughly 100,000 yen for living patients to 300,000 yen for families of the dead. Approximately half to twice a fisherman's annual income, offered to families who had already lost their fishing income, depleted their savings, and watched relatives deteriorate for years. The contracts were signed. Around this same period, mothers who showed mild to no symptoms gave birth to children with severe neurological damage, cerebral palsy-like presentations, profound hearing and vision loss, seizure disorders, inability to control motor function. Methylmercury crosses the placental barrier as readily as it crosses the blood-brain barrier. A pregnant woman eating enough contaminated fish to remain symptom-free was delivering a dangerous dose to her developing fetus. These children were initially diagnosed with cerebral palsy of unknown origin and were not connected to the factory. Methylmercury discharge from the Chisso plant continued for 9 more years. The Japanese government officially announced that Minamata disease was caused by methylmercury from the Chisso plant on September 26, 1968, 9 years after Hosokawa's experiment had proved it internally, and 36 years after Chisso first began discharging methylmercury into the bay. The announcement came the same year Chisso ceased acetaldehyde production, a process growing economically obsolete as cheaper alternatives emerged. Critics have argued that the government waited to confirm the cause it had effectively known about for nearly a decade until after production had stopped, because official acknowledgement while the plant was operating would have required regulatory action that industrial policy interests were not willing to permit. The certification system the Japanese government established in 1969 to determine who qualified as a Minamata disease victim required meeting diagnostic thresholds representing severe disease. Patients with partial or subclinical presentations were excluded, and the burden of proof was placed on applicants, with processing times measured in years. Approximately 2,955 individuals were officially certified as of the mid-2000s. The government's own 2009 Special Measures Law implicitly acknowledged that approximately 50,000 people had credible exposure claims. Non-governmental researchers estimate the actual affected population between 50,000 and 200,000. Depending on whether subclinical neurological damage is included. The certification system was the main mechanism by which the full scope of this disaster was officially suppressed. In 1969, a patient group filed a civil lawsuit against Chisso in Kumamoto District Court. Dr. Hosokawa, dying of cancer, submitted a written deposition before he died in 1970. His first and only public discourse of the CAT 400 experiment entered into the record 11 years after he had been ordered to suppress it. On March 20, 1973, the court found Chisso liable, ruling the company negligent in continuing discharge after it should have known the discharge was causing disease. CAT 400, presented through the now deceased doctor's deposition, established that the company had held actual knowledge since October 1959. A separate criminal proceeding eventually produced indictments against 2 former Chisso executives. Both were convicted, but neither served prison time. What the courts produced was a finding. The human record, what the disease looked like on actual bodies, and what it cost the people who lived through it, was assembled by people who had no standing in any court. The American photographer, W. Eugene Smith, arrived in Minamata in 1971 with his wife, Eileen Miyoko Smith, who served as a translator, researcher, and co-author. They lived in the community for approximately 3 years. The photographs Smith captured became the primary visual documentation of what industrial poisoning looks like at a human level. Michiko Ishimura had been there long before Smith. A poet born in Minamata, she had been sitting with victim families since the late 1950s, recording their testimony in their own words and in local dialect. Her book, Paradise in a Sea of Sorrow, published in Japan in 1969, describes the experience of the disease rendered in the voices of the people it had reached. She worked alongside victims as an advocate until her death in 2018. Minamata Bay was declared officially clean in 1997, following a remediation project that dredged and contained approximately 1.5 million cubic meters of contaminated sediment, and the fishing restrictions were lifted. The official record attributed the disease to methylmercury discharged from the Chisso Corporation's acetaldehyde production process, a finding the Japanese government confirmed in September 1968. 9 years after the company's own scientist had proved it in a laboratory. The civil ruling found Chisso liable, while criminal proceedings produced convictions, and the bay was ultimately remediated. Chisso Corporation was restructured, and the official record declared the matter closed. What the record could not close was this. Chisso's management chose, in October 1959, to continue production rather than disclose what CAT 400 had shown them. Every person who developed Minamata disease after that date, every child born with congenital neurological damage in the years that followed, was poisoned after the company already knew. The disease had reached tens of thousands of people by then, and most of them were never officially counted. Dr. Hosokawa died in 1970 before the ruling. The experiment he had conducted 11 years earlier, the one management had ordered him to bury, became the primary basis for the court's finding of Chisso's liability. He never saw the verdict. That's the report on Minamata disease. Thanks for watching Cold Wreckage.